if you have a fear that's nagging at you, and I don't think if you're afraid of being a race car driver, becoming a race car driver is necessarily what that fear is trying to tell you. Maybe it is. But I think seeing what it is behind that fear, like, what is that? A fear of death? Is it a fear of impermanence? Is it a fear of loss of self? I mean, these are the deeper questions that we can pry into when we start to really examine fear in a contemplative way.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Sivana Podcast. As always, we've got a really great guest in store for you today. Before we dive in, I want to remind you to head on over to SivanaSpirit.com/contest to enter each and every week for the chance to win an $100 gift card for the Sivana Spirit store. Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, which might surprise you, but is actually fear. I think we have so much to learn from our fear, and our fear can be such a great insight into what's holding us back. And here to talk with us about fear and the ocean and some other really interesting concepts today is Jaimal Yogis. He's a graduate of Columbia Journalism School, and he's the author of several best-selling books. Saltwater Buddha, which is a coming-of-age memoir about surfing, the sea, and yoga, and a reflection of his time after living for a whole year in a Zen monastery. And his book, The Fear Project, which looks at the neuroscience of fear and courage, using science, mindfulness, and sports to reveal how humans can live more fully. And he has a new book coming out, which I'm sure he's going to tell us about. I'm so excited to have you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
So you have such an interesting background and story. I'd love for you to tell us, just so we can get to know you before we dive in, how did you arrive at yoga? And what does your personal practice look like, and how has it evolved over the years? And then we'll go into talking about your first book.
Yeah, good question. I was a little bit born into the yoga tribe. My mom was Jewish and my dad Catholic, but they both ran into yoga in the 70s living in Boston. They actually lived and studied in various ashrams and named me after a yogi, Baba Jamal Singh, who was a teacher's teacher of a great yogi living in Boston named Sanchi at the time. So anyway, yoga was sort of around as I was growing up, but I didn't grow up, I guess, in maybe a typical yoga family. My dad was in the military, and their own practice sort of waxed and waned. Like, we would get into going to like Paramahansa Yogananda's ashram growing up for a couple of years, and then we would be totally out of that and, just watching football and eating at Sizzler. Both my mom has done yoga ever since I can remember every day, and we would join her doing, animal poses when we were kids. And then we sort of forgot about it once we were past 7 and moved out. It wasn't really until high school I was getting into lots of mischief, sort of typical teenage mischief, but I think I was always the one to get caught. So one thing led to another. I'd gotten a DUI. I was on probation for theft, which happened with the DUI, and various, I'd been suspended from school, and it wasn't a terribly big deal, but it was enough to make me feel like my life was in this downward spiral I'd never emerged from, and typical drama that you put on things in high school. And so I ran away from home. I had this vision that I needed to make a change, and I think because I had this spiritual foundation a little bit in our family, I had a sense that there was something better than just like partying in the suburbs with my high school friends, and that I needed a change. And at the time, it was sort of the ocean that symbolized this freedom. We had lived on these islands off the coast of Portugal when I was very young, and my dad was a surfer too. And at this point, we were living in Sacramento, landlocked. So long story short, had these dreams about the islands, took a one-way ticket to Maui, which sounded great. Of course, being alone at 16, very little money, I started running into all kinds of hardships and knew I needed something. And that's when some of this inkling of yoga and meditation came back to me. And I picked up, a mindfulness book at the local health food store in Maui and started to try it. And really ever since then, it's been a part of my daily life. I went on, as you said in the intro, to live in a Buddhist monastery for a year, thought I might be a monk, decided not to, went into the world to finish college, retreated from that again and went and lived with Baba Haridas at Mount Madonna and did a yoga teacher training. Again, thought I might want to be a monk with him. Ended up not. And then really ever since then, meditation and yoga have just been part of the daily regime. And I've been trying to integrate these big experiences that I had on long retreat, both at the monastery and with Baba Haridas and later in India and such, with workaday life. I've been a journalist and a writer for the last 15 years or so. And so, that brings me here talking to you.
It's amazing. I'm so excited in our conversation to talk about how you've made this transition from being literally a monk and then coming back into the real world and the chaos of daily life. I'm sure you have a lot to share there. Before we do, I want to ask you, when did you get really interested in fear? Because I know your book, The Fear Project, which I have so many questions about, really digs into the science of fear. And you've interviewed some incredible neuroscientists and really incredible thought leaders. How did this become something that you got so passionate and interested in?
I think it's almost like you can't be alive and not be interested in fear, because it's a part of our everyday lives. Whether you're experiencing it as low-lying anxiety or just, paralysis that can come over you in certain work situations, social situations, certainly in surfing. One encounters fear and just with the dynamism of the ocean. So I wouldn't say I thought I had a special interest in it, but what catalyzed the book was a bad breakup. Post-monk, been dating a woman on and off for about 5 years, thought she might be the one, everything went up in flames. And as breakups are commonly do, I was left with this feeling of desperation, meaninglessness, anxiety, inability to sleep, all the feelings that come with losing somebody. So, a bad breakup is really like a death. Just you're left having to start at square one. And that was where I found myself at, I think I was about 29 or so. And the interesting thing to me was that I'd been through a breakup this bad before one other time. And it was all the feelings were familiar to me. I knew intellectually I'm going to get my groove back. I'm going to be okay. But my heart and my body didn't know that. And they were just gripped with those feelings and those stories of, whatever, I'm not good enough, or I'll always be flawed. All the things that come up in a breakup and the fear can catalyze. And I thought, what is this disconnect? Why can I know something intellectually and feel totally different? And why can't my intellectual knowledge sort of supersede that and just feel good again? And so I had some theory based on, yoga philosophy and Buddhism, but I wanted to know what was the latest scientifically, because fear, as I read in the book, can make us sort of question everything we know, and we're gripped like that and we're paralyzed. It's like you can forget your own wisdom, which was really my connection to yoga and meditation. I gleaned a lot of wisdom from that, but then all of a sudden it was like I had none of that in this deep darkness. So that was what kicked off the book, and I learned an incredible amount about the science, and it's been interesting kind of integrating that with what I knew from yoga experience. I'm still making those connections, to be honest.
I'm fascinated and really intrigued with what you're saying about how intellectually you knew you'd recover. But the body and the spirit felt so broken. And I think that's something everyone can relate to. I think, we've all been through breakups, but on a deeper level, fear has this way of being so irrational sometimes. It shows up in our dreams, or we feel haunted, even though at an intellectual level, we know there's maybe no reason to be feeling that way. Can you talk us through some of the research that you uncovered when doing this exploration? For example, I know you talk about how fear actually evolved in our brain. And does that have something to do with it? I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, it's complex, but the basics are pretty simple in that the brain seems to have evolved a little bit like an onion. And so when you look back at early primates and reptiles, they have the same limbic system, which is like the core of our sort of brain near the brainstem. You have this little gizmo called the amygdala. It's about an almond shaped size. And you have, some other smaller pieces of the brain. And they basically regulate like motor control and emotion and a lot of instinct, sexual desire, fear, hunger, the things you need for basic survival. So that seems to be kind of what we started with, and it's the basics. And it does, you can get a lot done with that. And that part of the brain acts really quickly because you don't want to be intellectualizing when, the bear shows up. You want to just act. And that's how a lot of creatures survived, is kind of being nervous, fearful creatures. Like when you look at animals in the wild, they can be jumpy, around anything unknown. And we had to be that way as well. As, we became more of like a hunter-gatherer society. It wasn't our brute strength that kept us alive so much as our ability to cooperate and our ability to think and use tools. And that was, over time, the huge prefrontal cortex grew over that limbic system. And so we developed all these amazing skills to be able to allow us to do all the things we do now with future planning, mathematics, science, etc. But we basically kept the old system intact. And what the old system does is it acts really fast. And oftentimes it's faster than the intellectual part of our brain. It actually can send a message to the body faster. And so by the time you've thought, well, this isn't actually a threat, your limbic system's already sent a message to your body to fight, flee, or freeze. And so it's already there. The fear's there. It beat you to the punch. And then, so that's the system that we have. And the interesting thing is you would think that when you're envisioning a future scenario like, I live here on the beach, what if a tsunami? And I start thinking about that. You would think like the brain would develop another system for that type of fear. It's like, well, a tsunami's not coming right now, so I don't need all the adrenaline in my body to fight a bear or to run from the tsunami. But it doesn't. It sends a message to the old brain, the limbic system, and that amygdala sends the same adrenaline, everything. So if you're thinking about that at night, all of a sudden you've got all this energy and you're like, I don't need it now, I need to sleep. So it's really fascinating stuff. And where yoga and meditation become really interesting is they almost become like an evolutionary sport or evolutionary tool to integrate these systems, because when you look at meditators over time, they're often increasing actually gray matter in the hippocampus, the sort of area for memory, and areas of the prefrontal cortex that regulate fear. And the amygdala actually has even shown signs of decreasing over time during meditation. So it seems like there are some really fascinating brain changes that we're just starting to understand. That's a little bit out of my realm, but what the basic science shows us is that we need to understand our fear system so that it doesn't dupe us, so that when we are feeling that adrenaline and in times when it's irrational, that we have tools to be able to debunk it and keep moving toward the place that we want to go, so we're not held back. And yoga and meditation are definitely at the forefront of those tools. There are others as well that I discuss in the book.
Yeah, I think so many people don't fully realize that just thinking about something fearful and actually experiencing the fearful thing produce the same chemicals in your body, which is really amazing and also a little frightening because it shows us how much power our thoughts have. I'm curious because myself, and I'm sure all our listeners, have something that they're fearful or afraid of right now. And I know in your book, you talk a little bit about how to transform these fearful memories or things that are a little bit haunting us. What tips do you have? Or can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so cool, exactly what you're saying, like the power of thought. And as disconcerting as it can be to know that a fearful thought can paralyze you or fill you with dread, the opposite is also true, that a loving thought or a compassionate thought or a thought of something pleasant can also change your chemistry. And so we really do, mind over matter is a real thing. As soon as you're thinking it, your body sends messages, and every thought, every single one changes the structure of your brain. Our brains are plastic, as they say, or malleable, and every new thought is a new synaptic connection. So the other really fascinating thing with fear memories in general, actually, is that they found that every single time we remember something, we're actually contacting the same real estate in our brain as the original memory. So when I remember my dad coming home and saying, I'm leaving this marriage, is like, that was a pivotal moment of my childhood where I set up all these fears about relationships failing and my fears of abandonment. It's like every time I remember that, I am contacting that original real estate in my brain, and I can either and then I'm changing that with the way that I'm recalling it. So if I recall that memory every time I'm in a terrible breakup and I'm like, oh my gosh, see, confirmation, relationships always fail, they're doomed, I'll always be abandoned, whatever story that, it's like you're just compounding that memory, and it's basically surrounding it with more fear, kind of revving it up. The flip side, I could remember it purposefully in a therapy session or in a yoga class or in a meditation retreat or with laughing with friends. And I'm reassociating that memory with the feeling of safety and the feeling of love of that place. And so literally, that's how therapy works, is you recall hard things, feeling safe with someone, and you change the structure of your brain. And, this is getting ahead of the science a little bit, but my theory with a meditation retreat is that you'll notice as you sit there in silence for, days, that oftentimes repressed memories come up. And I think the brain is kind of saying, I have a chance now to bring this repressed fear out. And here's Jaimal breathing mindfully and he's feeling peaceful. And in that context, that memory is changed and it's healed. And so just consciously going into your fears and saying, this is a traumatic experience and I'm going to bring it up in a safe space is a way to change your brain. And then also change your fear structure. That's sort of the way that you can do it only in the thought realm. And then the exciting thing about that is it works even better if you're actually creating an experience around the thing you fear. So if you were knocked down by a wave when you were a little kid and you don't want to go near the ocean now, to first conjure that memory in a safe space, reorganize it, but then start moving toward water experience that are positive in baby steps. Maybe you take a swim class, maybe you watch Moana, and then, soon enough, you're going down to the beach and putting your toes in and, but taking baby steps, forming those positive experiences, then you really start to change your nature.
So do you think our fears are sort of like indicator lights of where the direction we actually need to head in?
That's a great question. I've read some intriguing stuff to that. And I think we're all trying to expand our comfort zone and expand the sort of container of being so that we can hold more love and joy. And fear, sorrow, sadness, struggle, those are all things that I think we can resist and sort of decide not to feel. And the result is a kind of dullness that because we're afraid to feel those things. And turning toward them and feeling into them is a way I think we sort of, as Kahlil Gibran says so beautifully in The Prophet, the deeper you carve into sorrow, the more joy you can hold. I think that's true with fear too, is like if you have a fear that's nagging at you, and I don't think if you're afraid of being a race car driver, becoming a race car driver is necessarily what that fear is trying to tell you. Maybe it is. But I think seeing what it is behind that fear, like, what is that? A fear of death? Is it a fear of impermanence? Is it a fear of loss of self? I mean, these are the deeper questions that we can pry into when we start to really examine fear in a contemplative way. So I don't think it's always apples to apples, like, I'm afraid of public speaking, therefore I need to be a speaker. That might be true, but what is it about public speaking that are you afraid of, that you're not going to be loved? Are you afraid of rejection? Those are the bigger questions that I think we bear a lot of fruit when we head toward them.
I love what you're saying here, because I think we're often encouraged, whether it's by fellow yoga friends or teachers or a therapist, to conquer our fears. And a lot of times it's like, why? But I really like what you're saying here, because I'm almost thinking of it as the less fear in the body, even if it's subconscious and suppressed, the more room, the more space there is for joy and love. Fear's opposite. I think that's really powerful.
The flip side of that, and one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, was because I think the theory you just said is exactly right. The less fear you have in your body, the more joy you hold. The only problem with that is that as practitioners, it can make us really resist fear. So when it comes up, there's this subtle space of, I don't want to feel that because it's keeping me from joy. And so oftentimes we sort of add this extra layer of like, oh no, here comes the fear, I don't want it. And the difference, which is, I'm not saying you were saying this at all, but there's a sort of subtle way of letting the fear be there and sort of acknowledging that you're a human being and not enlightened yet and full of joy constantly that allows like this sort of acceptance of it, which I think that's where the transformation of the energy takes place, because as soon as there's the acknowledgement, oh, there the fear is, that's okay. It's just energy in the body. There's this sort of like, okay, it's okay to feel this. Everybody feels this. And so I just wanted to make that subtle point because it's one that I fall into all the time of like, oh no, I feel anxiety and now this is going to be bad. And I'm constantly just having to turn back to, no, it's not necessarily bad. It's just let it be instead of resisting, because so much energy is spent on the resistance part.
I'm so glad you added that in. It's almost as like we have to be comfortable with fear and make it our friend. Otherwise, going into resistance doesn't serve us well. This segues really nicely into the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is not just getting comfortable with fear or being able to acknowledge it or sense that it's really just energy underneath it. But one of the things I know you mentioned in your book is that this fear can actually be a performance enhancer and strategically advantageous for us to befriend and acknowledge and be familiar with. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a really fascinating add-on to what I was just saying, where there's the label of, oh no, here's the fear again. And sort of if you take language out of the equation, it's like, well, what is it really? It's a heightened sense of alertness that can be uncomfortable, often because what the brain is telling the body is it's time to do something. So in certain contexts, that can be unhelpful when you're trying to go to sleep and you're thinking about an exam, like, oh, I just need to sleep right now. And that's when we need to bring out tools like, breathing mindfully, maybe doing a body scan before bed to, be able to relax that. But in other contexts, like right before your exam or right before running the 100-meter dash, a little bit of anxiety and adrenaline is actually a boost, particular if it's framed in the right way. So the way that performance looks is kind of an inverted U shape, where it's like if you don't have, you get up to just enough adrenaline at the peak of that U to be in the zone and be in your best. And as soon as you go into the red, so to speak, it's like the body tightens up too much and it's not energy anymore. It's like your movements are stilted. You see in sort of tunnel vision and not notice the flow of things going on around you. There are reasons for those different levels of fear and how the body acts, but suffice it to say that if you frame adrenaline as like, oh, I feel adrenaline, I feel a little anxiety, of course I do, this is a race, this is a test, but this is a thing that I love to do. If you frame it with that, this is the thing that I love to do, or there's a reason why I'm doing this, you're much more likely to be able to sort of get in that top zone or that performance enhanced zone. So at least this is what the research that I've seen shows. Like people tend, if they're taking a math test and you suddenly say, hey, guess what? You lose money if you do badly on this test and there's a video camera on you. That kind of anxiety will usually make people do worse if it's just sprung on them. But for people who really love math, when they get a little more stress, like this problem has never been solved by anybody, it can actually boost their performance on the test. And so what I like to do when I'm in a situation where I'm feeling an anxiety is, say before a big speech, is remind myself, like, I'm talking about something I love. It's actually good that I'm feeling some nerves because that's going to bring energy to this experience. And if I wasn't feeling any nerves, I might be a little bit on the dull or tired side. So just frame it in the positive, because that's the way to use the energy for, I think, the way it's intended, the way the brain is intending it to be used.
I think that's such a great tip. And before we move away from fear, I did have one more thing I was excited to ask you about, which was how to stay really strong in our own convictions, even if we're maybe fearful, when everyone around us or society at large has a different belief system or is acting a different way. I know in your books you talk a little bit about how fearful groupthink works, and I was hoping you could give all of us, including me, some tips about that.
Yeah, when I was looking at what we fear most, and it's hard to say this as a generalization, but I think what gives people a lot of anxiety, one of the reasons I think public speaking is the greatest fear, they say, when you look at polls, is that we really want to fit in. It is probably because when we were wandering around as tribes, if you were ostracized by the group, that was a death sentence, and we needed the group's protection in the Serengeti. It's also key for meeting a mate and reproducing. So it's so key to our survival, fitting into the group, that we really, really want this, and we really feel it if we're outcast. That said, we don't live in that world anymore. If you don't agree with your family, you're thrown. I mean, maybe some people, you might have to leave your house, but you can go and find your own house and find your own community. So we don't live in that world anymore where if you disagree, you're outcast and it's a death sentence. That said, it can feel like one. And our brains still sort of, I think that our DNA is still wired that way. And so when we come into a situation where we're maybe outspoken on a certain issue, I think just the knowledge of that this is the way I'm wired. I'm going to want to follow the status quo, because that is what my survival instincts are going to tell me to do. If I'm breaking out of that, it's going to feel scary. That said, there is no growth, no evolution toward a more enlightened community without people breaking the norms. And you look at all of the great, whether it was the Buddha leaving the palace and his, and leaving what the typical wisdom of the day was saying, or Jesus Christ overturning the tables at of the rabbis and saying, I'm going to do it differently, or Martin Luther King. It's like all of those people were upending a system, and it took an incredible amount of courage. And so, and they were ostracized by certain groups, but then they were embraced by a new one. So I think to remember that it's always going to feel scary to do that. But if you have a greater intention of compassion, love, etc., to sort of put it in some historical context and then follow that feeling of greater love, love really does overcome fear. And you can look at the neuroscience of this, which I talk about in the book, or you can just feel it and experience it yourself. That's my advice. But we all run into that, and it's tough. It's not easy.
I think that's such a great reminder, though, is that to know it's so normal and that you're just hardwired to feel this way, just like you'd be hardwired to run away from a bear if it was chasing you in the woods, and that the courage is in part to overcome those really programmed emotions. Before we talk about your upcoming book and your passion for surfing, I just am so curious, and I feel like our listeners must be as well. I'd love you to share with us, if you're willing, just a little bit about how you transitioned into living in a Zen monastery for a year, and then what it looked like to come out of something like that and re-enter back into quote unquote normal society, and what were sort of the epiphanies you had in that year of silence or semi-silence. Share with us about that.
It's a big one because, this is why I think I've written books that are memoirs, is that it was such a transition, and one that was shocking, that I think I've needed all of this writing and story to help me integrate. But yeah, first of all, I'll just say I think the monastery life is it's a wonderful life to choose. I'm just feel so fortunate and blessed that I was taken into a community where everybody is working so diligently on bettering themselves for the reason of wanting to be more compassionate, wanting to be more joyful, and giving up. You give up a lot of things that everybody tells us life is about. The success, having a family, and so the primary thing, though, about it is that the monastery I was at least in the Zen tradition, is you still have a very structured day. So you're not just loafing around because don't have to go to work. You wake up at 3 a.m, hour of meditation, an hour of chanting, then you're sweeping the floor and making breakfast. Then we had martial arts class, and the day was very regimented, and we did it again at night. So 2 things can happen in that environment. One, it's all set up around trying to create space in the mind, because you get into this sort of military regime where you know what you're doing that day. All of that sort of future planning and stuff is out of the question. So you really, where your food's going to come from, the community. So even though you're working hard on your schedule, it's like you have all this space to be present, and there's just so much support. And when you get to meditate, it's like you're just totally focused on that meditation step. And so you can enter these deeper states, and you can see why societies have set up a monastic life, because it's really difficult to approach those states of being, only getting 20 minutes a day, break to have stillness. That said, what happens quickly is that being human and, wanting pleasure and avoiding pain, you quickly in the monastery, start attaching to certain wonderful states and, shunning the bad ones. Whether, those just become different things of like, I don't want to clean the bathrooms. I want to go back to, my Zen practice, or, whatever it is. You develop your own little habits, likes and dislikes, your own ways of suffering and finding joy. It's just, everything is a little more contained. And then you go out in the world, and it's just, it's just chaos. Like after that, you're just like, I used to know, it's like I had my daily program, I had my meditation, everything was just so. And then all of a sudden you're thrown into the world of relationships with these huge roller coasters and, you know, the games of courtship and the competition for grades and then work. And it's like, I mean, it's night and day, and it's just so, the transition is so extreme that I found myself often pining to be back in the monastery. But then the thing that got me through it all, I think, was this Zen notion that any obstacle or any hardship out there, just like in the monastery, can be your teacher. And so I started looking at the world as like, well, the world is pretty challenging. So all of these obstacles are my teachers. They're a way of coming back to this point of oneness that surrounds both yogic and Buddhist teaching, that somewhere under here, you know, these ups and downs are pointing me back toward a unifying principle. So that's why I wrote my new book, All Our Waves Are Water. It's a meditation on that, about how the ups and downs of life can point us back towards this unifying principle, and how they're actually tools, and tools that you often miss out on in the monastery because everything is so structured. You can miss out on some of the surprise teachings that life throws you, both the high highs and the low lows. But yeah, I'm still in the process, and that's probably why this is a long-winded answer.
So I'm going to ask you what I think is a really hard question, so you can opt out. But just because you have this incredible background, I can't help myself from asking, do you think the true yoga is in the monastery or being out here in the real world? I guess what I'm asking is, like, which is the bigger challenge?
I think it's so individual, and this might come off as a little bit of a cop-out, but I know that for me at that time, when I was in the monastery or when I was at the ashram with Baba Hari Das, that was what I needed. And there was no better place for me in that time. And it had its real challenges. I mean, going into deep stillness can be frightening. Giving up the things that you want, you know, in the world, quote unquote, is frightening, and not doing what, you know, most of society suggests is the right way is frightening. So those were challenges that were there, you know, certainly not, you know, renouncing a relationship was, could be scary. It can also be very peaceful. So out here, it's just different. The challenges are different. The challenges are dealing with the unstructured nature of the way a workaday life goes, you know, paying the bills, etc. It's all yoga. I mean, that's the beauty of the tradition of yoga, is that, you know, washing the dishes is yoga, service is yoga. It's where your intention is at. That's the real yoga. So if you intend to wake up raising kids and, you know, bartending, if your intention is strong enough, you'll see God there. You know, you will find it. That said, you know, it can be, I think we need the support of a community, and it's why the whole tradition was built the way it is. We have monasteries, ashrams, retreats. The way I think of living in the world that I'm finding and learning over time is that we go in and out of the monastery. You know, we go in and out of retreat, and we go and find that depth, and then we come out into the world and we try to spread that love to people out here. and I think that back and forth can be incredibly profound because of that you appreciate the retreat when you have it. You're not just sort of like, you know, waiting for lunch like you can do when you're used to it at the monastery. And then you also have these great challenges when you're outside in the world that can be teachers. That said, you know, it's just, some people feel the call and they want to, you know, they find a teacher and they know this is what I need to do. And there are incredible benefits to being in that sort of community. So I think it's all about individual nature and intention.
Yeah. And I love what you say is that, you know, you don't have to go to a monastery to see God, like you said before, because I think that's really empowering for people who are just living a quote unquote ordinary life. It's really the intention behind it. And I'm so glad you shared that with us. as we wrap up, I know your big passion is the ocean, is the sea, and I will hands up admit that I am the person who is terrified of the ocean. I mean, I'll swim in it, but I'm definitely scared of waves. So I have some things to ponder now that we've chatted. Maybe I should take some extra swim classes or go a little deeper to figure out what that's really about. But I know for you, it's been a huge source of inspiration. You now have written 2 books about the ocean. Just share with us a little bit about this connection between Zen and water before we part ways.
I do love the ocean, and it was something that was important to our family growing up. And then I think I also love the metaphor that it offers, that we're all like waves on the ocean, that the sea is sort of our divine nature and that unifying principle, and that every wave has its own individual nature, and it's that individuality that's beautiful and that is fun to ride if you're a surfer, but that the foundation, we are all water. And that's always just been so helpful to me. It's for my yoga practice. But then, being out there in the ocean, I mean, is where we came from. We're still mostly water. Our brains are 80% water. I've even heard from scientists that the amniotic fluid that we bathe in is 99.9% genetically identical to seawater. So there's something very special and primordial about coming down to the waterfront and returning to that basic substance of life. Obviously, that life is in everything. It's in the parking lot too. But I think something special happens to the mind when we're submerged. And so surfing is just one way of relating to the sea. I think if you love to swim or you love to just walk on the beach, it shifts our state, and it's just another tool, but it's one that I just really love. As so many Buddhists and yogic masters have said, 84,000 Dharma doors, and why shouldn't surfing be one form of yoga? And it is for me, but like you said, it's not for everyone. And I think if you're afraid of the ocean, I think you can get just as much pleasure, sitting on a bluff above it. But there's also probably some benefit in going toward that and learning to ride a wave. I'm happy to take you out.
Yeah, you've definitely inspired me to be a little bit more courageous next time I'm at the beach. So I have you to thank for that. And I want to remind all our listeners of your books, Saltwater Buddha, the first one, The Fear Project, and available for pre-order right now, All Our Waves Are Water, the newest book. And we'll put links to all of those below. And Jaimal, what's the best way for people to stay connected with you?
My website, JaimalYogis.com, has most of what I'm up to, but more regular updates, Instagram and Facebook are probably the best way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us. I know I got a lot out of this conversation, and I really appreciate everything you shared. So thanks so much for coming on the show. And to all our listeners, we will be back next week. I'll talk to you next time. Namaste. Hi everyone, Brett here with an announcement. We are starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Sivana Spirit. If you'd like to enter the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savanaspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, would really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes and left us a review. Leave us some comments. We love your feedback, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might also enjoy it. I also wanted to invite you to go check out Sivana East, which is the name of our blog, and also the name of our Facebook group, where you can ask questions, see who's coming on the show, and share your ideas. We will post the most recent episodes there, as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and topics on the shows. Again, thank you so much for listening, and from my heart to yours, namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana Podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to savanaspirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at facebook.com/Sivana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at sivanaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Sivana Podcast.